the talk that I had been thinking of and brought to fruition for this presentation is something called Coming to Terms with the Claims of Baha'u'lláh. And I actually think that you'll see as we go through the talk that these are very much the same topic, I think. And so let me tell you what I had in mind. And I'll go through this a little bit. You know, I think when we encounter the writings of Baha'u'lláh, they're absolutely magnificent. And, you know, for us sort of feeble humans, we have to sort of back up and sort of figure out what exactly is going on here, hearing these magnificent and sublime words. And what I wanted to do was to take you on my own journey, if you will, really coming to terms, and what helped me come to terms with the magnificence of the writings of Baha'u'lláh. And so that's what this talk is about. And it's really very closely aligned with Steve's presentation, which is the search for meaning and purpose in our universe. So first off, let's start with something we always try to do, and that is to talk about the basic truths of the Baha'i Faith, for those of you who may be new to it. So the Baha'i Faith is a global religion now. It's the most diverse community of people on the planet. It's in over 220 countries and territories. There are Baha'i communities everywhere on the world. It's not a big religion, but it is very spread out and extremely diverse. And its teachings are the most universal, really spiritual and social teachings that the world has ever known. So it's a majestic, comprehensive, universal body of truth that the world is only beginning to encounter. And it teaches that there's one God who is the ultimate source of all reality, that the great religions of humankind have come from the same God and a reflection of the divine will, as God's will manifests itself in history and forms religions that through revelations that become religions that we all know, Christianity, Islam, and so forth. Because the world is always evolving and changing, these revelations of God that have come through the great messengers of God also change and adapt their standards to the age in which they appear. And that Baha'u'lláh, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, revealed a religion that represents the standards of God for our time in history. And, you know, Baha'u'lláh throughout his writings, and this is very clearly stated in Baha'u'llah's writings, as well as the writings that came after him, that the central principle of his revelation is the oneness of humankind, for us all to see each other as part of one human family. So I'm not going to go into great detail on Baha'u'lláh himself. Baha'u'lláh was Persian. He was born in 1817. He announced his revelation in 1863 in the city of Baghdad, where he had been exiled to 10 years before. So the Baha'i writings encompass the period of time prior to Baha'u'llah's revelation, in which he really explained a lot of the fundamental principles of not only his own revelation, but all of religion. And then when he announced his revelation, he had a community of people who were really educated to understand his claim. And many of the quotes and so forth that we're going to go through represent that body of literature, that body of explanation that Baha'u'lláh brought into the world. And then from the period in Baghdad in 1863, for the next 29 years, Baha'u'lláh was further exiled, ultimately to what is now modern day Israel, known as the Holy Land. It was Palestine at that time. And he was exiled to a prison colony there and ultimately passed away there in 1892. All the while, what ended up being 39 years of revealing God's will for humanity for this time in history. And Baha'u'llah's writings are, I can't even describe them. I mean, they're just beyond words in terms of their beauty and significance and depth. Humanity has never seen anything like Baha'u'llah's writings. And so for us, and for me, as a young man coming to terms with Baha'u'lláh, you know, that's what this talk is about, is how do we come to terms with the majesty of Baha'u'llah's writings. So when I first became a Baha'i and started to read the Baha'i writings, I found myself in a conversation with a lovely lady who was giving me some guidance on how to learn about the faith. And she said, you should get a Baha'i book and you should read it every day, morning and evening. And I chose Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'lláh. And later I got this Writings of Bahá'u'lláh here, which has been bound several times. And I would go through that and I would read it morning and evening. And as many of you, I'm sure, have experienced, when you do that, you enter a sublime universe of meaning and challenging and beautiful words. And so I liked Gleanings. Gleanings, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is a compilation of Baha'u'llah's writings that was published in the 20th century. And it really has it's sort of a wonderful sort of representative sampling of the writings of Baha'u'lláh. And so many people start there. The other work that's worth bringing up is the Hidden Words, which is probably my second step in my exploration of the writings of Baha'u'lláh, and are very different from Gleanings, and just a magnificent set of short phrases that capture the heart in a way that can't be fully explained. So many of my quotes and other things will come from Gleanings and the Hidden Words. Again, many of the passages can be found in from Gleanings itself. So when you begin to read the writings of Baha'u'lláh, there's something that strikes you immediately, and I want to go over this quote. So this is a quote from Gleanings from Baha'u'llah's tablet to the kings. So this is the kings of the earth, mostly European kings, but also the king that had been responsible for his exile and imprisonment, as well as the Ottoman Empire and so forth. Baha'u'llah says, "O kings of the earth, he who is the sovereign Lord of all is come. The kingdom is God's, the omnipotent protector, the self-subsisting. The treasures you have laid up have drawn you far away from your ultimate objective. Wash your hearts thoroughly from earthly defilements, and hasten to enter the kingdom of your Lord, the creator of earth and heaven." So I think the thing that strikes you most in this passage is that Baha'u'llah is clearly claiming a station that is above that of the kings of the earth, that is sublime and transcendent. He is the King of Kings. He is claiming to be the King of Kings. He is telling them that their treasures and all of their wealth that they've built up in their kingdoms have taken them away from where they really need to be going as human beings. And he invites them to wash their hearts thoroughly from that and to hasten to enter the kingdom of your Lord. Now, you know, I had grown up in a Christian society, so these words, these were real meaningful words. The kingdom of God is a very strong Christian idea that Jesus had mentioned. And Baha'u'llah, of course, is using that same expression to talk about his own revelation, right? So there's a lot in here. This is 3 lines. There's a lot in here in terms of the claims of Baha'u'llah. And you have to sort of come to terms with that. You have to say, what's really going on here, right? So the first thing to note is that this is not new, right? We've seen this phenomenon before, right? And when you read the Gospels, you see these passages where Jesus is speaking and how people reacted to his speaking. So in the Gospel of Matthew, it says that when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. So it's one of the things you notice in the writings of Baha'u'llah immediately. He speaks with tremendous authority. And then of Christ, in one of his famous passages, says, "I and the Father are one." And he says that in front of the priests. And they picked up stones to throw at him. And they said, "We're not stoning you for any of your works, because his works were good, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claimed to be God." Right? So this phenomenon that we see with Baha'u'llah was also present in the time of Jesus Christ. I think I figured out why that's a problem. So what many folks from Christian societies don't recognize is that really the same process was happening in the Holy Quran when the Prophet Muhammad announced his claims. "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet," is the most famous line in all of Islam, right? And so, you know, in this statement, the Prophet Muhammad is clearly relating himself to God as his representative on earth, right? So the claims of Baha'u'llah are not new to us. We've seen them in history before, right? So there's this great 20th century Christian theologian and thinker named C.S. Lewis, who was at Oxford or Cambridge. I don't remember which, actually. C.S. Lewis is known in the modern day because he was a professor of literature, and he wrote the Narnia Chronicles. So the Narnia movies, the 3 movies and so forth, that was all created off of C.S. Lewis's work. But in addition to writing fiction, he was one of the actual great theologians and thinkers of the early 20th century, particularly dealing with the forces that existed there. Increasingly, people were starting to question religion and so forth. And C.S. Lewis had been an atheist and had come to Christianity later in life and wrote about that. And he's a wonderful, pragmatic thinker. And in one radio interview, he talked about how about responding to Jesus. And he was actually critical of people who said that Jesus was a great moral teacher, sort of patting him on the head and saying, you know, okay, you were a really great moral teacher. And C.S. Lewis pointed out, and I think correctly, he said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And, you know, I think there's a lot in this quote about the nature of Baha'u'llah's claims as well. They are so majestic. He speaks with such authority and power that he really kind of makes you make a choice about the nature of who he is. And as C.S. Lewis pointed out in terms of the claims of Christ, which were of course the same as the claims of Baha'u'llah, he really didn't intend to let us make a choice. You almost have to make this choice that either Baha'u'llah was something other than that, or he was a manifestation of God, and his claims are real. So it's a challenge, right? And so when we see Baha'u'llah's claims, this one always struck me. You know, Baha'u'llah saying, naught is seen in my temple but the temple of God, and in my beauty but his beauty, and in my being but his being, and in myself but himself, and in my movement but his movement, and in my acquiescence but his acquiescence, and in my pen but his pen. There has not been in my soul but the truth, and in myself naught can be seen but God, right? So, I mean, you can't get any clearer than that about the nature of Baha'u'llah's relationship to God, right? So when we read these writings, you're almost forced, you enter this universe where you're forced to kind of make a decision as to how you feel about them. So, you know, I was extraordinarily taken with the writings of Baha'u'llah early in my Baha'i life, and found them absolutely exhilarating. And but you know, as you go through adulthood as a thinking human being, you're trying to place that within the context of everything else you experience. You're trying to place it with what we know about science, between what we know about just society in general and social phenomena, history and the great philosophies of the world and so forth. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we're forced to sort of think through this. And, you know, Christian thinkers, you know, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, centuries after Christ, were spending a great deal of effort trying to bring the claims of Christ and understand the claims of Christ within the great philosophies of their day, you know, which was mostly Greek philosophy. But those great theologians were going through this process of asking themselves, what is this phenomenon and how do we understand it? And those, of course, became the great theologians of Christianity. And I think we are at this stage in our development as the Baha'i community asking the same questions and thinking about this in the same way. What is this phenomenon? And I think that, you know, not when it happens once with Jesus, that's an event, right? When it happens with the Prophet Muhammad, and now with Baha'u'llah, now we're talking about a phenomenon. And you see that in the writings of Baha'u'llah, that he starts to refer to this faith of God that is more universal. And he even refers to himself in a more generic form as the manifestation of God. And we'll get into that. So really, this is a talk in some ways about what is the nature of a manifestation of God and how do we think through that. So Baha'u'lláh explains in many of those tablets that were written prior to his revelation, particularly in a work of great majesty known as the Kitab-i-Gand, or the Book of Certitude. That book is really an answer to a lot of the theological questions that have Christians and Muslims over the years, in particular Christians and Muslims, have dealt with. And Baha'u'lláh uses both Christian and Islamic scripture to explain the relationship of God to humanity. And in that, the first principle of that is that God is fundamentally unknowable, right? He says the door of knowledge of the Ancient of Days is thus closed to the face of all beings. But God has caused what Baha'u'lláh refers to as the luminous gems of holiness to appear out of the realm of the spirit in the noble form of the human temple and be manifest to all men, that they may impart unto the world the mysteries of the unchangeable being and tell of the subtleties of his imperishable essence. So the manifestations of God, these messengers of God, of which Baha'u'lláh represents, are God's representative, if you will, appearing out of the realm of the spirit in the noble form of the human temple and expressing its will to all humanity. And Baha'u'lláh, one of the, these ideas, I mean, I first learned of them when I was 16 or 17 years old, and I still think, despite all my liberal arts education and everything else, that they may be the most powerful and beautiful ideas I've ever known, that these great religions of humanity are part of the same divine will interacting with humanity. Baha'u'lláh says that each of these messengers of God is a mirror of God, reflecting naught else but his self, his beauty, his might and glory. So if you stop and think back a little bit about this, God is unknowable to us directly, but is manifest to us through his creation, of which we are the most developed form at this point that we know of, right? And so the God appearing in human form is God appearing to the most developed form of human within our form, if you will, right? And Baha'u'lláh says that every one of these is the way of God that connects this world with the realms above. So you could talk about what does he mean by the realms above? And then he says they are the standard of his truth unto every one in the kingdoms of earth and heaven. They are the manifestations of God amidst men, the evidences of his truth and the signs of his glory. So what is happening in these writings of Baha'u'lláh, particularly from this period, is that Baha'u'lláh is starting to help us understand the phenomenon of the manifestation of God, as opposed to just Jesus or just the Prophet Muhammad. Cultures tended to be focused on only that which they experience. We live in the modern day. We have internet access and can look up anything any minute, right? So now we can see the manifestations of God, not just as singular entities, but as a phenomenon. And Baha'u'lláh teaches us about them as a phenomenon. And he describes how they've appeared and clothed in diverse attire. And if we observed with discriminating eyes, we should behold them all as abiding on the same tabernacle, soaring in the same heaven, seated upon the same throne, uttering the same speech, and proclaiming the same faith. So now all the manifestations of God we can see in a coherent context, right? This is an extraordinarily important idea, and maybe the greatest idea that I've ever known, right? That all of these great religions are actually real, that they have truth and value, but we have to understand them within the context of history, but they all represent one unfolding faith. It's still the most beautiful idea I've ever known. So, Baha'u'lláh goes on to really unwrap many of the mysteries that challenged the Christian theologians after Christ. When Christ said, I am God, what did he mean by that? And then, of course, he referred to himself as the Son of God and made distinctions between himself as the Son and his Father in heaven. And how do we sort through that, right? And so, this is Christian theology, right? This is the whole question of Christian theology. And Baha'u'lláh answers that from the perspective of a manifestation of God. He says, were any of the all-embracing manifestations of God to declare, I am God, he speaks the truth, for it hath been repeatedly demonstrated that through their revelation, their attributes and names, the revelation of God, his attributes and names are made manifest in the world. So they're not God, but they're God to us, because they express God's attributes within the creation that we can understand, right? So thousands of years of Christian, or hundreds of years, well, thousands of theology is explained in several paragraphs. And then, Baha'u'lláh makes it clear that he as a man is not important. That what is important is the revelation that he reflects. And this comes in many passages. This is a famous one from Baha'u'lláh to the Nasruddin Shah, the Shah, the king of Persia, and who was ultimately the one responsible for his exile and imprisonment. And Baha'u'lláh says to him, he says, "O king, I was but a man like others, asleep upon my couch." And now this is a metaphorical couch, right? This isn't an actual couch. He's giving this idea that he was asleep and then was awakened, right? Metaphorically. He said, "I was but a man like others, asleep upon my couch, when lo, the breezes of the all-glorious were wafted over me, and taught me the knowledge of all that hath been. This thing is not from me, but from one who is almighty and all-knowing." And then Baha'u'lláh expresses that, he is simply the vessel for the revelation of God. And he says, "I don't control it." He says, "This is but a leaf which the winds of the will of thy Lord, the Almighty, the All-Praise have stirred. Can it be still when the tempestuous winds are blowing?" Right? So Baha'u'lláh expresses his own relationship to what he feels in his heart and how he can't be still. He needs to reveal it. He said, "The evanescent," meaning himself, "is as nothing before him who is the ever-abiding. His all-compelling summons hath reached me and caused me to speak his praise amidst all people." So, Baha'u'lláh in another passage says, "Not of my own volition have I chosen to do this, not of my own will. I didn't choose to do what I've done. I didn't choose to claim what I've claimed. The will of God has stirred me to my depths and forced me to do this." So, I'm having my freezing problem again. Let's see if I can avoid it. There we are. In a beautiful passage that always struck me, Baha'u'lláh says, "When I contemplate," this is a prayer, "when I contemplate, O my God, the relationship that binds me to thee, I am moved to proclaim to all created things, verily I am God. And when I consider my own self, lo, I find it coarser than clay." Right? So what Baha'u'lláh is doing is expressing to us that what's essential about him is not his own person, and we shouldn't worship his own person, but the revelation of God that flows through him. And our job in this day is not only to see that revelation is real, but to see it part of the whole faith of God as revealed to humanity, the beautiful virtues, the sublime ideas that come through all the revelations of God, right? So this really is actually a discussion of the nature of the manifestation of God. That's what we've been doing. And everything I just said, you might hear at any Baha'i introductory meeting, but I think those ideas, as I've learned through life, are much more profound than we even maybe Baha'is recognize. And let me go through a few more passages that have really helped me to come to terms as a modern person with the claims of Baha'u'lláh. So in a first sense, the manifestations of God and the teachings that they bring represent the standard in the world, the standard for human behavior, and also they open up a world of consciousness, I suppose that you could say, and open up a new world of understanding that goes beyond what we experience on a daily basis, even through science. And, as I've gotten older, I've recognized that standards are very important, right? Everything that we honor in the world as being of true excellence is because it has high standards, right? And the revelation of God is no different. And Baha'u'lláh, speaking to the leaders of religion, says, "Weigh not the book of God with such standards and sciences that are current amongst you. For the book itself is the unerring balance established amongst men. In this most perfect balance, whatsoever the peoples and kindreds of the earth possess must be weighed, whilst the measure of its weight should be tested according to its own standard." So, the early passage I read from Baha'u'lláh, as challenging as those are, the challenge just simply continues, right? Baha'u'lláh is now telling us that the revelation of God for any time in history represents the standards of that age. And there's nothing that compares to it, right? Now you have the golden ideal. What they reveal is the golden ideal. And all of us are now asked to try and reach up to that new standard. And Baha'u'llah is saying, don't weigh my revelation. He's talking to the older religious leaders. Don't weigh my revelation by your sciences, the things, your theologies, your ideas, because it's a new standard in the world. And so, understanding on one level that the manifestation of God is a standard bearer, right, who brings new teachings into the world. And of course, we all know the oneness of humanity, the breakdown of prejudice, all of these beautiful ideas that Baha'u'llah has brought into the world now represent new standard of God. So the religion itself has been redefined and recreated by the manifestation of God. So there's a wonderful passage in Gleanings, which I always found to be really helpful because, Baha'u'llah attacks this question of the nature of revelations of God in many different angles throughout his writings. But I found this particular passage to be meaningful. Let me preface it by saying at the beginning of the passages I don't have on the slide, Baha'u'llah describes that humanity has been endowed with many gifts, right? We've been given the gift of sight, the gift of rationality. And he says that we should praise God for having these gifts. And this is a beautiful idea because, when we look at the world and everything that's been given to us, even when I take my dogs for a walk and you look at the beautiful scenery and think of what a majestic and beautiful place we've all been born into, right? I mean, we didn't deserve to be here. This is a paradise in many ways. And so, and we've been given the consciousness to understand it and the eyes to see it and the ears to hear it. And Baha'u'llah asks us to think about the world in that way. And then he says that which is preeminent above all other gifts is incorruptible in nature and pertains to God himself is the gift of divine revelation. So everything we've been talking about, the sacred books of the past and Baha'u'llah's own words, every bounty conferred by the Creator upon man, be it material or spiritual, is subservient to this. So these revelations of God are the greatest gift that humanity can have. And in many ways, getting back to the original topic for this week, which was the search for meaning and purpose in the universe, they are where the meaning and purpose of human beings, the search for meaning and purpose in our lives, they are where we find our goal, finally, right? Baha'u'llah goes on to say, it is in its essence and will ever so remain the bread which comes down from heaven, the revelations of God. It is God's supreme testimony. Now pay attention to these descriptions. They're very important. It is God's supreme testimony. So, testimony means, a witness, if you will give a testimony saying that such and such occurred, right? This is God's greatest witness to his existence. The clearest evidence of his truth, similar to the first. The sign of his consummate bounty. The token of his all-encompassing mercy, the proof of his most loving providence, the symbol of his most perfect grace, right? Those lines are very important, I think. Providence is this idea, this concept of God, that God is engaged with humanity, that God cares about the world. There are concepts of God that are, that God exists, but is detached from the world and doesn't care about humans at all. And that's a popular idea nowadays. And Baha'u'llah is really saying it's the process of these revelations of God coming to humanity that are the proof that God isn't that kind of God, that detached, uncaring God, that he is a merciful God, a most loving God, and hands down the revelations of God to evolve our own consciousness. And he goes on to say, he hath indeed partaken of this highest gift of God who hath recognized the manifestation in this day, meaning Baha'u'llah himself. And then he tells his reader, render thanks unto thy Lord for having vouchsafed to thee so great a bounty. Lift up thy voice and say, all praise be to thee, O thou, the desire of every understanding heart. And if you think about this search for meaning and purpose in our universe, if God is going through the trouble of revealing these revelations to us for our guidance, that means that God cares about humanity. That means our lives have meaning and purpose. That means there is an answer to the question, is there meaning and purpose in our universe, right? So a lot depends on this thing, right? This thing is actually a really important thing. and is actually the most important thing in many ways. So there's a lovely tablet of Baha'u'lláh which has not been translated fully. It's been translated provisionally, called the Tablet of the River, in which he gives some examples, and it touches on a number of very important topics, and I'm sure when it is formally translated, it'll be a source of great discussion. But there's a metaphor that Baha'u'lláh gives in this about the nature of the revelations of God. And I'm going to go through a couple of slides here that go through this issue of these metaphors that Baha'u'lláh uses to help us understand the revelations of God. And this one I was very struck by. Baha'u'lláh talks about a river, and he talks about it in different senses in this tablet. But in one sense, it's clearly the revelations of God themselves, right? The words of the manifestations of God. And he says, in every age and century, as he desires, the unique hidden one, that's God, and that internal essence, that's also God, manifests that true river and the real sea and causes it to flow, adorning it with a new temple and a new vesture. So I love this analogy, because when I think of the Baha'i Faith, and I think about people encountering the Baha'i Faith, they're encountering it in a very natural way. They're seeing something on a sign, they're going on a trip to India and they happen upon a temple in New Delhi, or they're somehow coming upon it, or they meet a Baha'i at work. So it's a very natural sort of thing. But in reality, what it is the revelation of God slowly percolating out to humanity as a river, of a beautiful, sublime river of virtue and beauty that is percolating out to humanity. And Baha'u'lláh talks about this river, and he says, when God sends a new river to flow, it knocks down some old structures. It's like a flood. It causes some areas to become completely desolate because it knocks down those old structures. But at the same time, that new river gives water to areas that had previously been parched. And then those begin to grow new flowers and new vegetation. So it's this beautiful metaphorical idea of the power of ideas and how they transform humanity. So we could talk about the Tablet of the River quite a bit. But the other set of writings that really helped me to understand the nature of Baha'u'lláh is the Writings of the Bab, who of course was a manifestation of God himself, whose mission was to prepare his followers for the coming of Baha'u'lláh. And but the Bab was extraordinary, and in the various analogies and metaphors that he gave. And I love this one. And he says, if on the day of his revelation, so the Bab is, revealing a religion before Baha'u'lláh, and then preparing people for his way. And he refers to when Baha'u'lláh comes into the world. He says, if on the day of his revelation, all that are on earth bear him allegiance, mine inmost being will rejoice, inasmuch as all will have attained the summit of their existence, and will have been brought face to face with their beloved, and will have recognized to the fullest extent attainable in the world of being the splendor of him who is the desire of their hearts. So there's a lot in here, and it struck me very much when I first read it. They will have attained the summit of their existence. That's a pretty strong word. They will have been brought face to face with their true beloved. They will have recognized to the fullest extent attainable in the world of being. That's everything. The splendor of him who is the desire of their hearts. So the manifestations of God as a phenomenon bring into the world a revelation of God that is the goal of all our desires, right? Ultimately. So the Bab, in one beautiful analogy or metaphor, talks more about this. And he says, listen, he says, no created thing shall ever attain its paradise until it appears in the highest prescribed degree of perfection. So paradise for something is to achieve its highest degree of perfection, right? That's a beautiful definition of paradise. And then he goes on to say, for instance, this crystal, I assume there was a crystal there on the table, represents the paradise of the stone, whereof its substance is composed. Consider likewise every created thing. So the Bab actually says in one of his writings that everything in creation is ultimately constantly in a process of trying to perfect itself. and attain its own paradise by perfecting itself, which is a very interesting idea, by the way, even biologically. That little COVID virus, I think, is doing that exact same thing right now. But, this process of evolution then, and this is me going a little bit speculative, but this process of evolution is biological matter seeking to attain a higher degree of perfection, right? So that's a really important idea. So then Baha'u'lláh says, the Bab says, man's highest station, however, is attained through faith in God in every dispensation and by acceptance of what has been revealed by him, and not through learning. Inasmuch as every nation there are learned men who are versed in diverse sciences, nor is it attainable through wealth, likewise or other transitory things. True knowledge, therefore, is the knowledge of God, and this is none other than the recognition of his manifestation in each dispensation. So, we've gone from this very striking passage of Baha'u'lláh where we're trying to figure out, what is he saying here, and how do I relate to this, to understanding that everything in creation is trying to achieve its perfection, and that actually coming to know of a manifestation of God and follow their teachings is the path to humanity's perfection, right? So that's a very coherent and beautiful way to think about this. And the Bab goes on to say, he says, there's no paradise, more oneness for any soul than to be exposed to God's manifestation in his day, to hear his verses and believe in him, to attain his presence, which is not but the presence of God, and to sail upon the sea of the heavenly kingdom of his good pleasure, and to partake of the choice fruits of the paradise of his divine oneness. So keeping in that same theme, that the paradise for everything is to attain perfection, and the perfection is really to have the opportunity to come into to develop a personal relationship, if you will, with the manifestation of God, the perfect representation on earth of the highest virtues and values that can be expressed by a human being. So I wanted to tackle something that troubled me a little bit, and that is this whole idea of, what happens when we die, right? And how does this relate to what happens when we die? This is a major theme in religion. It's a major question that people have when they think about religion. Christianity, on an extreme level, some Christian sects have said, if you don't believe in Christ, you're going to hell, right? So that's an extreme view, and all Christians believe that, but so we've kind of developed this dichotomous view, right, of the nature of our relationship to God. But what's evident from the writings of Baha'u'lláh and his explanation of this process is that's not quite how it works, right? That God is manifesting revelations according to our capacity. So it's more, the metaphor that might be more appropriate is the growth of an individual human being, going through stages of childhood to adolescence and so forth. And if that's the way God is managing our spiritual affairs in this world, right, then that has to be part of the process as we go on to the next world, right? And so, there's this very important passage in the Gospels where Jesus says, and he's talking about his own death in this passage, and his followers are mourning, even while he's still there, the possibility of him dying, and Jesus is telling them, I'm going to die soon. And then he goes on to say, my Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? So Jesus tells his followers that his Father's house beyond this world has many rooms. And Baha'u'lláh gives us now with his revelation, a much more sort of fleshed out, comprehensive view of what Jesus meant. And Baha'u'lláh tells us that as our souls progress through the worlds of God, is what he says. So I would say that that's the same thing as what Jesus meant when he said, my Father's house has many rooms, is that our souls will traverse through different worlds of God as we go through our spiritual evolution. And Baha'u'lláh says that, know thou of a truth that the worlds of God are countless in their number and infinite in their range. None can reckon or comprehend them except God, the all-knowing, the all-wise. And he says every man will advance and develop through these worlds until he attains the presence of God, which is, by the way, I think can't be actually God, because we know that that won't be possible, but there must be some spiritual state that we reach that is metaphorically described as the presence of God. And so What Baha'u'lláh is telling us, I believe, is that our souls after this life will continue to progress. And there's a very interesting tablet of Baha'u'lláh in which he says that in that world, the next world, the manifestation of God appears there. And the process of people developing spiritually is the same way that it happens in this world, this natural evolution, heart to heart, person to person, where we all set standards and we grow, and that we'll continue to do that. And that the manifestation of God appears in that world in a different form, just as appropriate for that world. So when we get to these questions, I think it's important to recognize that all of this is a process of spiritual development for human beings. We really don't, there is no hell in a sense, right? It's all, everything is relative in our spiritual development and process. So if you can imagine, now you can understand, or we can understand, the significance of a manifestation of God coming into the world and why Baha'u'lláh speaks about it in such glorious terms. You know, he says, this is the day whereon the ocean of God's mercy has been manifested unto men. The day in which the day star of his loving kindness hath shed its radiance upon them. The day in which the clouds of his bountiful favor have overshadowed the whole of mankind. And we should celebrate and we should lift people up as a result of the beautiful fact that proof of meaning and purpose has come into the world, right? So now is the time to cheer and refresh the downcast through the invigorating breeze of love and fellowship and the living waters of friendliness and charity. That should be our response to this magnificent news. You know, the Christians talk about the Good News Bible, right? And that's this kind of news, that meaning and purpose has come back into the world, and we no longer need to live with existential doubt about our truth. So this is a very powerful passage of Baha'u'lláh and how he expresses what he has done for us. He said, the ancient beauty hath consented to be bound with chains that mankind may be released from its bondage, and hath accepted to be made a prisoner in this most mighty stronghold that the whole world may attain unto true liberty. He hath drained to its dregs the cup of sorrow, that all the peoples of the earth may attain unto abiding joy and be filled with gladness. Spirituality and religion is about joy and gladness, and really finding your beloved. It's a beautiful thing, most beautiful thing that you can experience. So I just put some passages here at the end of the talk that I just want to briefly go through, where, you know, I talked about how the revelations of God are like a river, you know, that individuals accept the manifestation of God, and then they need to manifest that the recreative power that the revelations bring into the world to the rest of humanity. And Baha'u'lláh tells his followers, "O friends, be not careless of what you've been given. Be not careless of the virtues with which you have been endowed. Neither be neglectful of your high destiny. Suffer not your labors to be wasted through the vain imaginations certain hearts have devised." So the people that are trying to pull them away from his path, right? He says, you are the stars of the heaven of understanding, the breeze that blows at the break of day, the soft flowing waters upon which must depend the very life of all men, the letters inscribed upon his sacred scroll. With the utmost unity and a spirit of perfect fellowship, exert yourselves that you may be enabled to achieve that which beseems this day of God. So, yeah, just, not God, I can't even, I'm crying talking about these words. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But, you know, what is that telling us? You know, with the utmost unity and a spirit of perfect fellowship, share this with others, right? This most great bread that comes from heaven. You know, Baha'u'lláh tells us that his revelation is for unity, and that the book of God has been wiped clean of any form of contention and conflict. And he says this very clearly. He says, "O ye that dwell on earth, the distinguishing feature that marks the preeminent character of this supreme revelation consists in that we have, on the one hand, blotted out from the pages of God's holy book whatsoever has been the cause of strife, of malice and mischief among the children of men, and have on the other laid down the essential prerequisites of concord, of understanding, of complete and enduring unity. Well is it with them that keep my statutes. It is not his to boast who loveth his country, but it is his who boasts it is his who loveth the world. Through the power released by these exalted words, he hath lent a fresh impulse and set a new direction to the birds of men's hearts, and hath obliterated every trace of restriction and limitation from God's holy book. It's a very important passage. The believers of the revelation of God in this day need to be builders of unity, and to work with others to make the world a better place, right? That is the command of God for our time in history. I was very powerful in one of Baha'u'llah's last tablets, the Book of His Covenant. And it's a very powerful passage, I believe. Baha'u'llah again emphasizes, he says, the religion of God is for love and unity. Make it not the cause of enmity or dissension. Conflict and contention are categorically forbidden in his book. This is a decree of God. It is divinely preserved from annulment and invested by him with the splendor of his confirmation. Verily, he is the all-knowing, the all-wise. That which is conducive to the regeneration of the world and the salvation of its peoples and kindreds of the earth have been sent down from the heaven of the utterance of him who is the desire of the world. And this line has always struck me. Better is this for you than all that is on earth. You know, so I now get a sense of the years of thinking and reading these passages and so forth, and feeling this. As you see, I have trouble getting through these passages sometimes without breaking up, because they're so beautiful and so powerful, and their sublimity is so great that it really recreates you. So I really urge everyone to really read Baha'u'llah's writings. Much like I was urged all those years ago, and it's been probably the greatest advice I'd ever been given by any human being. You know, Baha'u'llah talks about his words. He says, the word is the master key for the whole world, inasmuch as through its potency, the doors of the hearts of men, which in reality, the doors of heaven are unlocked. So look what he's saying there. I mean, this is a majesty of Baha'u'llah's words, right? He tells us the word of God is the master key, but he says that the doors of heaven are the heart, our own hearts, right? So there's so much in these writings that you start to read them and it's unbelievable. And he tells us that this word is an ocean inexhaustible in riches, comprehending all things. Everything which can be perceived is but an emanation therefrom. And that's another aspect of the writings. They really reflect the divine will, but nature reflects the divine will. So, you know, you're really sort of reading the book of nature when you read the writings of Baha'u'llah and the writings of all the great revelations of God. So you want to get started on this, join a Ruhi program. You are going to start and to be exposed to the greatest set of words I've ever known and the most exhilarating body of knowledge. So I urge you all to do that. So with that, I'll end my presentation. I hope you enjoyed my own personal reflections, put together somewhat hurriedly this morning on the nature of Baha'u'llah's revelation and its effect upon my own heart, and some of the ideas that have really helped me to think through his revelation and what it means for humanity and what it means for me personally. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for that talk. It was just amazing. All the quotes from Baha'u'llah I hadn't read before, and some of the ones from the Bab as well. That it was really amazing to hear all of that. So thank you again.
You're welcome.
So now we can have our Q&A portion. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and I will read it out loud. So we have a question asking, why do we not believe in reincarnation? Why do Baha'is not believe in reincarnation?
You know, Baha'u'llah explained that that the world that we go to after death is not this world. It's not the same as this world. The worlds of God exist beyond this world. And that we continue our journey in that other world. And that's the nature of the reality of things. So we don't believe in reincarnation because he says that's not actually what happens. And of course, you know, we have to rely on the manifestation of God telling us the truth of things. I think that reincarnation, though, is I think a relatively good way to metaphorically represent the nature of what happens to us after death. And I think that, you can imagine that for some people in the past, explaining the nature of what happens after death is that they will come back with, as another being that exists in their own world, maybe, and how they grade those would have been a way to explain the nature of things to people with more restricted worldviews, right? So, and humanity's progression intellectually and spiritually has been a progression from sort of the concrete to the abstract. And so I think that reincarnation was a way at one point of teaching that our lives have consequences, what happens to us and how we live our lives has meaning and will be rewarded or punished in the next world accordingly. And that fundamental truth hasn't changed, even though we've been told now that we actually don't come back to this world, but we continue to progress. And what we've learned scientifically is that we are part of an immensely expanded universe, right? This is an immense creation. We are only a small part of it. And Baha'u'lláh tells us that that's not true, not only true in the expanse of the material universe, but it's true in the expanse of the spiritual universe. There are levels of experience above us that we can't experience, that we will experience as we grow through the worlds of God.
Thank you. Our next question asks, could you please explain the term seal of the prophets?
Yes. So the term seal of the prophets comes from a line in the Holy Quran, and I may misquote it, but the Prophet Muhammad says, Muhammad is not a man among you, but is something, and then the seal of the prophets. And that has always been interpreted to mean the seal in the sense of the last prophet, right? You put a seal on something. But there's other aspects of the nature of the word seal, right? There is, when you would send a letter in the past, you would close it with a seal, right? And you would imprint on it the specific sort of identity of who you were based on your seal. So everyone had their own seal. So they'd have a little wax and then they'd imprint it. So one could interpret that meant that the Prophet Muhammad was saying he was the representative, was sort of the was the best example of prophethood, if you will. And so I think that what Baha'u'lláh tells us is that the revelations of God will continue to come to humanity, and that, each of these revelations of the past, by the way, I just want to pause for a moment and say that this thinking that exists in Islam, that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, is very similar to the same thinking that exists in Christianity, that Christ is the last messenger until the day of resurrection, or that exists in Judaism as well, in traditional Jewish religious thought. And so this idea that revelations come and then stop and then never come again has kind of, in a sense, been disproven because they keep showing up, right? So, Baha'u'lláh is now telling us that that's not how it works. The process of God's interaction with humanity is an ever-evolving and dynamic one. And so the seal of the prophets could not mean, in that sense, the last prophet. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Our next question asks, what exactly is heaven and hell, and is there a devil?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And paradise has different meanings in the Baha'i faith. And so there's, and Baha'u'lláh uses it in different ways at different times. Of course, we had that passage where the Bab says that the paradise for anything is to attain perfection, right? So to become the most perfect violinist in the world, or to become, is to, in a sense, attain the paradise of that experience, right? It's simply the best that you can be. The paradise for human beings in this world, Baha'u'lláh tells us, in this world, in the world you and I are living in, having a Zoom call in, the paradise for what we can experience in this world, forget about the next world, this world, is to spiritually connect with the words of a revelation of God, to spiritually connect with the manifestation of God, to get close to his presence. And, there were, in time of Baha'u'lláh, there were thousands of people that would try to trek literally 1,000 miles to come to be in his presence because they viewed that as paradise. And Baha'u'lláh told them, you don't have to trek that far. You can just read my words and get close to the revelation of God. So I think in this world, and there's a very powerful passage of Baha'u'lláh says, which he's asked, is paradise real? And he says, it is real. And in this world, it is attainment of me and what he says, my good pleasure, meaning doing the will of God, because then we're so fully enriched as humans. So, and then he goes on to say that there are paradises that exist in the worlds beyond, that we will go on and have more paradise. So paradise and hell are sort of this spectrum, right? Whereas hell is distance from God. And, but they're simply words to express degrees of spiritual closeness or nearness from God. They're not what the Bahá'í Writings tell us is that there is no absolute place like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where everybody's going to go, right? If you don't, some people would regard Philadelphia as hell. I personally don't feel about it that way. It's a really nice place to live, but there's no place that you go because you're in hell, right? It's simply an ever-evolving spiritual place, but spiritual process. And we all can have days where we're in hell and days when we're in paradise. So it has multiple meanings and subtle meanings, but the greatest is really to come into close to spiritually with a manifestation of God.
Thank you. Our next question asks, when Baha'u'lláh says there are infinite worlds of God, is he referring to just heaven or universes as well?
That's a very good question. So my understanding of that question, and I've thought about this myself, when Baha'u'lláh says there are infinite worlds of God, is he referring to the material universe and the different, I heard once on a scientific talk, there are more stars in the universe as there are grains of sand in all the beaches of the world, right? We live in an incredibly vast place. It's almost impossible to imagine how vast. So does Baha'u'lláh mean by that worlds of God, meaning the planets? Does that mean that? Or does he mean that there are worlds of God in terms that are abstract to us, that are real, and that they are also as unlimited, as limitless, if you will, or as nearly infinite as what we experience in the material universe? And I personally, if I interpret the writings correctly, personally feel he means both. I think both are true. I think the worlds of God are, I think in that quote I used that he meant the spiritual worlds of God, but there are other passages where Baha'u'lláh is more clearly referring to the physical worlds of God in terms of the planets and so forth. I hope I'm not answering.
Thank you. Our next question asks, thank you for the talk. I'm a new Baha'i, so I have lots of questions. After death, will we have a physical body or just a soul? And how many worlds are there after this one?
So we will not have a physical body after death. That's fairly clear in the writings. We will go into another world that is an abstract world. The essence of us as human beings is abstract. It doesn't fully exist in the material world. And that we will, in our next world, we will be conscious. The Bahá'í writings tell us we will be conscious. We will remember our lives and the people we met. We will remember our parents and our loved ones. We will see our parents and our loved ones in the next world. And that, it will be a broadening and opening that will lead us to see this world as like living in a closet. That it will be an expansion of our consciousness, similar to what may have happened when human beings started to look out to the heavens and really realized how big the universe was, right? That when we get to the next world, we will realize, oh my God, we're part of something so much grander. And we'll also, Baha'u'lláh tells us, get a sense of, understand more deeply what really is, what the world is really about. And we'll be able to see ourselves in terms of how we've developed spiritually. And and whether or not we have. And, you know, so it's like in this world, you know, people can see how they're doing in relation to others. You know, I watch the Olympics and I see I'm not very good at running track. And so, you know, in the next world, those kinds of truths will be revealed to us, but in a spiritual sense.
Thank you. Our next question asks, in science, some scientists are saying that there are more dimensions than the 4 dimensions, X, Y, Z, and time. What is the 5th dimension, and is there a 6th dimension?
You know, that is a very good question for Steve Phelps, who was the original scheduled presenter of this. And Steve is a physicist and somebody who thinks very abstractly about the physical world. Probably not the best question for me. But, you know, I think it's important to recognize, and that these kinds of discussions help us understand that we are living in a closed space that's characterized by 3 dimensions and so forth, and that it doesn't have to be that way, right? We can imagine more dimensions. So our imagination reflects the fact that you know, there are potentially to have other things, but that's getting into spaces I'm not very good at. I'm a doctor. I'm not, you know, ask me about how to treat your cholesterol. That's as far as I can get. Thank you to Alex, who posted, and I think an answer to the question about paradise. Paradise in the first life, that's our life, is his good pleasure. This is from Baha'u'lláh, is his good pleasure in entering his cause. So, you know, this is what it means to be a Baha'i, right? I mean, it's a magnificent thing. I mean, it's a transformational thing, right? It's you know, paradise in this first life is his good pleasure. You know, this is a word that's used in the Baha'i writings, good pleasure. You know, it's the process of doing what God tells you to do, basically, or lining yourself with the divine will. I always think about it as one of these, you know, these walkways at the airport, you know, where you're walking, but then you get on one of these things and you can really propel yourself a lot further. Or you know, getting in the Gulf Stream and the Finding Nemo, you know, they would try to get in this Gulf Stream so they could get to where they want, right? So, you know, I think that for us as humans, once we get into that paradise of the good pleasure of the All-Merciful, you know, now in our spiritual development, we're in the Gulf Stream, right? We're not just floating around in the open seas now. We're on a track, and so. And then following the laws keeps us on that track, or following the teachings of the faith. And in this, I'm commenting too much on this quote, but let me finish it. Paradise in the first life is his good pleasure in entering his cause. After the ascent of the believers from this world, they attain the peerless paradises and are blessed with innumerable bounties. Those paradises are the fruits of actions that were undertaken in this world. So, yeah.
Thank you. Our next question asks, why do we die? Is it because we eat bad things, like a lack of nutrition? And in the future, will humanity be vegetarian?
So now this is starting to get more in my wheelhouse, because I am a doctor, and much of what I do all day is to try to preserve people's lives for as long as they can live them. And unfortunately, the reality is we all do die. It is the nature of the reality of our entity to die. Entropy is a fundamental, you know, the ordered states go to disorder as a fundamental nature of all reality. So any created thing, any composite thing, will eventually fall apart, and we are that. So our bodies will do that, and we can preserve our bodies as long as we can. Okay, here's I'm going to give you. I should do another talk on how to what I tell patients. This is what I do all week. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Olive oil is very important. It's proven in terms of the foods that are proven to maintain your life longer. Fruits and vegetables, olive oil, nuts, coffee. Coffee's good. Every study that's been ever done shows that coffee's good. But mostly keep up with exercise as well. Maintain your weight. Keep your blood vessels from being corroded with cholesterol or smoking or diabetes. Keep them flowing so they can preserve your organs for as long as you can. That's how you stay alive longer. Red meat is actually harmful to the human body. in great amounts. So we should try and avoid it as we can, because no, it's been shown that vegetarian diets are healthier overall. And it's also true that, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, and alcohol should be avoided as well. That's just purely physical stuff.
Thank you. Our next question asks, do the teachers of all faiths have something to teach us? And will there be more manifestations?
Absolutely, there'll be more manifestations of God. Baha'u'lláh, this is what I'm trying to get at, actually, that Baha'u'lláh tells us that this is the process, right? This is like gravity. This is like, how, we learn about physical processes, the weather and how things work. And we're like, okay, we got that. We understand how it works. Now we can predict it. Well, Baha'u'lláh tells us this is the process of how God interacts with humanity. And so that's why the seal of the prophets cannot be true, because it's not the way that works, right? It works that as human consciousness evolves, God sends new messengers of God into the world to help evolve that conscious to the next stage. So there absolutely will be more manifestations of God as humanity continues to develop in its understanding of our spiritual reality. What was the first part of that question, Bayan? I'm sorry.
Do the teachers of all faiths have something to teach us?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I have been so enriched by studying the great faiths and reading the passages. Last week, Vasu Mohan talked about the Bhagavad Gita. Read the Bhagavad Gita. It's wonderful. And it will teach you a lot about the quality of detachment that's in Baha'u'llah's writings. Read the beauty of the Gospels. Buddhism is unbelievable, really teaches you a lot. And then you'll read the hidden words and you'll understand what the hidden words are talking about when you understand some Buddhist principles. Studying the revelations of God from the past is one of the great bounties I think Baha'u'lláh has given us. Not only has he given us this great revelation, but now recognizing that the other great revelations of God are also true, we can study them and be enriched by them. But when you do that, you understand that they reflect the conceptions of the people of that time. So, for instance, this question about reincarnation, that's a part of Buddhist teaching. So when you read the writings of the Buddha, at least if they've been passed down, they weren't originally written, so it was several hundred years before they were written down. But what was passed down, the Buddha framed his teachings within the concept of reincarnation. And that's not opposed to Baha'i belief, because Baha'u'lláh tells us that the manifestations of God speak according to the conceptions of the people. So, the Buddha taught within that conception. And so, but what he outlined as his path to enlightenment and to liberation is a very similar path to what Baha'u'lláh talks about in the hidden words and in other passages. So, we really should, I think, read it, because it gives us a different perspective. And then we find there's more richness in the writings that we didn't expect. So reading other revelations is extremely important.
Thank you. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Williams, for your talk. I think everyone really enjoyed it. It was really moving to see your reaction to the writings, and also all the questions afterwards really exemplify how we're all thinking deeply about this topic.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So now I will introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker next week will be Miss Faith Holmes, and her topic is Can Our Thoughts Shape Our Reality? My Personal Journey Out of Darkness. And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern Daylight Time, so please invite your friends and family. And if you are new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please fill out the Google form that we will put in the chat below. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Have a great week.